overlap.
Yeah, and that's fine too. If things overlap, that's encouraged even. That's fine, not a problem.
It becomes a story.
Yes, exactly. You've got it, exactly. So we're pleased to have Renate Sutherland with us. Thank you, Renate, very much for joining us today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
And we're going to start out, as we always do, with a little bit of background information about yourself for context only. So if you could tell me, where were your parents born?
Well, my mother was born in a small village just outside of Berlin, Germany. And my father comes from Transylvania, Romania, which is the German ethnic groups within Romania. And that's where he grew up, and then went to Germany for future studies and stayed because the war interfered, met my mother, and I was born in Berlin during the war.
Very good. And when did you come to Canada?
I came to Canada in 1953, and my father came in 1952, and as a displaced person.
Okay. And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
Well, my elementary education was in Berlin, and I had 1 year of English at the time. And then when we came to the Chateauguay Valley, because my father was a hired man working on a farm the first 3 years, I went to Huntingdon Academy for a couple of years. And then my father was offered an opportunity to work at the farm at McDonald College, McGill. And so we moved to St. Anne de Bellevue, and I had my secondary education at McDonald High School in the 50s, and then went on to study at McGill in education, and also at the University of New Brunswick.
Okay, and what is and were your occupations?
Well, I'm a high school teacher. I'm retired now, but I was a high school teacher of Latin, history, and German. And I taught for 36 years in the public and private sector in the Montreal area. But I was also a principal of a German heritage language school on the West Island for about 15 years, at which time I had the opportunity to organize student exchange programs with Hamburg, and also worked with Vanier College and Marianopolis College, who had German programs at the time. And so we organized together with the Heritage Language School and the study, where I was teaching German at the time, these exchange programs for about 10 years, more than 10 years. And that was a fabulous experience, because students of 16, 17, 18 years old experiencing different cultures in different countries. And it was a very enriching experience for everyone.
Okay, and where do you live now?
I live in Point Claire. I've been here for over 40 years.
Okay, very good. So we're going to get to what I call the meat of the matter, which are questions concerning your personal experience living in Quebec today. And I will start off with, what is the best thing in your experience about living in Quebec?
Well, the best thing is the fact that I've lived here for 70 years. I've been able to go to school, university here, become a teacher, loved my teaching experience within the English-speaking school system in the greater Montreal area. And I just enjoyed teaching the high school level in the English school system, because at that time, that was the only option, because I was Protestant and couldn't teach in a French school, couldn't even go to a French school when we came to Canada, because, and if we did, my parents had to pay a fair amount of money for the three of us. There were two siblings and myself, and they just didn't have that money. So we learned our French in the public school system at that time, which of course has tremendously been improved over the years. So my experience really has been in the English-speaking sector in education. And I love Montreal, the European flair, the culture, ethnic, multicultural, many different languages, the diversity of it, affordable housing, because so many of my siblings are no longer in Quebec. My parents and my late husband and his parents, who grew up in Quebec, have died. So I'm really the only one here with one of my sons. My other son is in Halifax. So I really had wonderful opportunity teaching children how to learn. And the language component, and I found that when I was teaching in the German language school and developed some of the German program for the Ministry of Education, that it was very important teaching children how to learn, and then the language acquisition can be done at the same time or later, but it was very important. And the English system concentrated on that and promoted that and enriched it. And luckily, my husband went to school here in Quebec, so my children could go to an English school. And at that time, I found it really very interesting. And that was sort of the beginning, because even during the 60s and the 70s, it was a very exciting time to be teaching, because there were a lot of changes coming in terms of the school system, in terms of the curriculum. And we had a lot more freedom of the curriculum in those days. We could have all sorts of projects, especially in history. And I remember Latin was taught. There were 14 classes at the high school I taught in, Côte Saint-Luc. And when McGill dropped its entry requirements in Latin, there were no more Latin classes, which I thought was also interesting. But it was interesting when we had to apply to prove eligibility to English services when my children went to English school. And that was sort of the beginning of a lot of changes that we're still seeing coming now. So that was sort of interesting, but I enjoy living in Quebec. I have cousins who came from France who also live in Quebec, although at the time when they came in the 50s, they found it very difficult to adjust to the Francophone community. So I've seen it all, experienced it all, and but it's still a wonderful place to be a part of. And I've had the privilege of being involved in the forefront of educational change, both through union activity, the Provincial Association of Teachers, and I continue to do that. So I have a bit of a history, because my son, who's here in Montreal, was president of the Montreal Teachers Association, sort of following in his parents' footsteps. My husband too was a teacher in the English school system and administrator. And very often he comes and said, Mom, you know, what's the history in education? We sort of live in what's going on now. And if you don't really know how all of these things have developed, it becomes a bit more difficult to sort of move forward. So I've always found that very interesting. And that's been part of what I've been doing, in still being involved in some of the professional organizations, including the Quebec Retired Educators Group. And it's been a wonderful journey. And then by doing the work here in Quebec, you of course have opportunities to share and become involved with some of the other educational institutions right across the country. And I'm also involved in university women's clubs, and had wonderful opportunities to share sort of my knowledge and interest, and have been enriched by all of that and continue to be.
Okay. Now, the next question, a lot of people have trouble with it, and I certainly, if it was posed to me, I would have trouble with it, but I'm going to ask you to answer it as it's stated, but you're free to elaborate on your answer, of course, in any way that you see fit. So having said that, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Well, somewhat disillusioned. I don't feel isolated, and I don't really feel disconnected, although it depends on the circumstance. but I still feel that there's a role to play, and I continue to contribute to it, and be supportive to my church, community organizations, professional organizations, so on. But I am beginning to be a little disillusioned, because there are divisive laws that are sort of coming through the government channels, which in some cases are rectified, but they also seem to really not appreciate the diversity, and especially in Montreal. I think, that's another issue. I think there is a real disconnect between the rural and the urban centers, but that's not just here in Quebec. I think that happens everywhere. But I really am disillusioned about, there is very little recognition or acknowledgement of the diversity and of the contributions that have been made by the Indigenous groups, by the Black community, by the allophones, by anybody who is not part of pure Laine Francophone. And I've also discovered it's not enough to really speak French. That alone is not, and you see that in people in the public service and in various other professions that are close to you. If you're an immigrant, if you come with your accreditation, the accreditation isn't valid or valuable. You have to sort of start all over again. So there is, which was not the case when I first came to Canada, because at that time the immigration people, and surely they were agriculturalists, I guess, and they were federal government, they really followed our family to the point where when my father was here by himself for a year, immigration made sure that there were accommodations for the family that was to come. Now that was 70 years ago. So I don't know how it is, but there doesn't seem to be the same kind of welcome or opportunities or openness or invitations for everybody to contribute. Bilingualism, to be multilingual in this world is an advantage. And yet here we see it as a disadvantage. And it's politically being driven by the people who are in the decision-making forum. And to me, that doesn't sit well, and it's not right. And I'm not even sure how that can be changed.
Okay. Now, where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I think it's all of them. And I think under the umbrella of the English-speaking community, really. This is not to say that in some of the organizations, community organizations that I'm involved in, like the Montreal Council of Women and the Montreal University Women's Club and Zonta International, that we have people from all over the world, including Francophones. So we do participate, and everybody sort of rallies around the opportunity. And many of them are not-for-profit organizations helping families, women, young, refugees, immigrants. I'm part of a church social justice group that works out of downtown Montreal with interfaith communities, Muslims, Jewish, and Christian, as well as opportunities for refugees and immigrants. And I was on their board for a number of years. So, my opportunities are everywhere, but I guess basically they're within the English-speaking community and its various satellites, and the allophone community as well. So, this is not to say one doesn't come in contact with people from the Francophone community, but it's not as much, other than individuals and their participation. So.
Now, the next question I'll preface a little bit too. A lot of people ask me about the second part, about the official definition of Quebec. People have said, well, Dave, according to who? And that's a very good question. And my response to that is always the same. It's what you perceive to be the official definition. It could be influenced by what the Quebec government sees, what the federal government sees, what you see in the media, what you read. It's really your perception of the official definition of Quebec. So that's what I mean by official definition. So having said that, I'll then ask you the two-part question and you can respond. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Well, I've got my definition. I'm going to go with my own definition first.
Okay.
And that is someone who lives in Quebec, who was born and who lives in Quebec. And that includes many others. It does not include me, but that is only because I wasn't born here, but I live here and I participate as best as I can. The official definition, I think, is what it's sort of colored by the political discourse in terms of, you know, the official, Canada is officially a nation. Quebec is officially a nation, and its official language is French. And that's fine, but it does not really, in its application, really make provisions or acknowledges that there are many other groups, many other people who are not who don't feel part of it. I don't feel part of it. I think that's where the disillusion comes in. And I'm not sure that what I can do to change this sort of narrow definition. And I think that definition really, by its definition, because it excludes and does not say who is included in that, except by what we perceive, what we hear, who proposes this, that, and the other. And I think a great deal of that also has to do with social media, with the media in general, who, you know, yeah, they speak for various stakeholders. So the official definition I don't like, because the Constitution sort of protects everybody. And I'm not sure that this definition really does. Certainly the vibes that I'm getting from how it's being implemented or how people feel, there's a real fear of anybody who's different, especially if you have a different color. I'm white, I'm privileged. And I'm, you know, but what about everybody else, especially at a time when you know, the movement of people in the world and the need for peace and stability is, and what are we doing? We've got the largest country in the world here with resources, living within 100 miles of the American-Canadian border, and we're not ready to share, even when people are here. To me, that just, I don't understand. I have difficulty, and that's all part of my disillusionment. And we all work very hard at the ground level in our communities. And yet when it comes to the decision-making at the decision-making, political decision-making, none of that is reflected. So.
Okay, well, that leads us into our next question. Has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, I think it has. And certainly I'm seeing the changes in public institutions, in the whole healthcare and education in particular, where in education in particular, when you have a large segment of high school students not graduating in the 21st century, I mean, there's something very drastically wrong in our system, in our institution. When everything is directed from above in order to achieve this sort of sense of nationalism and identity, cultural identity, where one group has the majority at the expense of minority groups who may or may not even be recognized, let alone recognized for the contributions they make. But it seems that they are a burden, and a burden to society, and their contributions are not recognized. So that's sort of where things have really changed. This emphasis on the provincialism, on the rather than outward looking, we become inward looking. And it's all about me. And I think it's sort of, I mean, you see it everywhere. See it in the States. Hopefully we don't get there, but we can't be sitting on our laurels either. So what does one do? How does one change some of the systems? You know, racism is one of them. When people's experiences, and I don't have the experience that many of them have, but if you're not white, you live a different life. And when you have a government that doesn't recognize it or says, well, you know, it's an isolated, totally for those people to be disconnected to really what happens. It's the same as the workers, you know, the people in society who look after each other, our healthcare workers, poorly paid. Job training is sort of minimal, and yet they're needed. You know, and we don't recognize their importance. We have I think, still an academic education system. And I'm aware of the system in Germany where you have academic training and you have professional training and you have all sorts of training alongside everything. And here we have people coming in with all sorts of, you know, their own careers, because that's part of the policy we have in immigration. And they come here and they can't even practice it. And we have the example, especially in Montreal, you know, of educated people from the Arab world who can't practice. So there are a lot of elephants in the room. And how does one, you know, individuals, and the other thing is our systems, we all work in silos. We don't communicate, we don't consult, we don't work together. And yet in the school system, we teach cooperative learning, we teach cooperative doing things together, looking out for each other, teamwork. And everything in politics is about this person and that person and this ministry and yeah.
Well, so, that's an excellent segue into the next question, which some of your responses have already covered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway for the record. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
I think the developments in technology, but I think that's not just in Quebec. But I think for as we age, seniors in particular, use of the telephone, the use of social media, the use of, you know, being on Zoom. There's a large segment of people who can't do that, who don't have the resource, who don't have the knowledge. And the assumption is that everybody works on apps. Well, that's not true. And even even trying to get hold of utility services, or even although government, it's not too bad. you have to go through all these hoops. So there is a disenchantment with the system when you need it, when you need help, and the healthcare system is prime example. Family doctors are non-existent. You making appointments, delays for surgery. That whole system is broken. And just putting money into it is not going to do it. There has to be a complete creative reorganization. And I sometimes wonder whether or not the people, again, in government, and Quebec government is so much a part of our life. It's everywhere you go. It's so political. When I go and visit my son in Halifax, I say, there isn't this constant bombardment of all of this stuff. All to say, do they not go and vision and plan and become creative and see what works, what doesn't work, rather than saying, well, we don't have enough workers, we have to find them. Well, where are you going to find workers when you don't have enough people and you have a lot of retirees and people are leaving professions and are retiring and then are called back, but nobody's going back because the conditions are so horrible. That to me is a system that is just, I don't know. And everybody's sort of trying to work within that and making do, creating their own life as best as they can. But is this overall umbrella that is constantly harping away at, which does, and it doesn't meet the needs that people really have. Housing is one of them. Healthcare is another. Education to a certain degree. To me, that, and I'm glad, I've had a wonderful career. I've had a wonderful life. We were fortunate. I think my boys probably are too, because they have jobs, good jobs. They have housing, they can travel, they're multilingual, and they've learned their French here and are using it. But I'm not sure anybody coming in or those on the margins in smaller communities, if you don't have your pension, I have pension income, I'm lucky. So there are all these things that are there, but yet not everyone is able to be a part of that. And there seem to be so many roadblocks in some of these things that I think part of the problem is that our bureaucracy is huge. When the main employer in the province of Quebec is the civil service, and it excludes a lot of people who live in Quebec from being in that, what is it? Is it 2% or less than 2%? Part of the, it boggles my mind. But there has been a tremendous increase in the administrative work by all sectors in society. I know even in my last couple of years of teaching, the forms I had to fill out in teaching for the school or the school board or the ministry. And it didn't matter if you were public or private school, because the private schools are essentially part of the public sector because they're supported by them as well. So, and this administrative work in all sectors and in all professions, all lines of work. And at the same time, the government is withdrawing or undervaluing some of the administrative support services for everyone. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And I think those are my real concerns, together with the divisive legislation bill 21 and 96.
Okay, well, we're good. In the next question, we kind of drill down a little bit more to get more of a response on some of these issues. So I'll just ask the question. In recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns do you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, right now I'm well, but if I am not, and I need healthcare services and long-term care services, if I have the financial resources to be in an assisted living residence, I'm okay. I also have the option of, in this province, of going private. But I really don't want to do that. But I'm also aware that I may end up in a community on the island of Montreal where there are no English services. And when there are no English services when you're ill, and when you're weak and don't have the stamina and the energy to fend for yourself, what does one do? And I see this amongst my former colleagues and circle of friends, many of whose children have moved elsewhere, but they're beginning to move there, partly for family reasons, but also because the support that used to be available here for English-speaking people is diminishing, and I think that's a concern. I think that's my biggest concern, and having to deal with government or even institutions that have to operate totally in French. I would have to get help to do that. Doesn't say much for wanting to be independent when you can't do that on your own. So I think that's really my biggest concern, that the very things that I've been able to enjoy may no longer be there, especially if I'm not living on the West Island of Montreal.
Well, in the next question is a very general one, and you probably covered in some of your responses, but again, I'm going to ask it for the record anyway. What is the biggest problem facing Quebec, and how, in your mind, do you feel it could be resolved?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the divisive government legislation, which really produces negative social media. It really puts people on edge, because it excludes in law and in some of the administrative structures to enforce this law. And it concentrates and does that for those people who are already marginalized and who are not part of Quebec society just because of their religious affiliation, or their dress, or they're part of a minority. I think, the secularization of Quebec, the secular law, is a real, just a total, I think, a total reaction to the power of the church. And I think the Quiet Revolution replaced the church, the government replaced the church. And so you see the same tendency, to see the same attitude, you see similar, a structure from top down. I remember when I was teaching, we in the English system had a lot more freedom to implement our curriculum and add to it and enrich it. And of course, we had resources that we could draw on from other provinces, etc. But in the French system, the curriculum was like that. And my children never went to French school, but I heard that from families who sent their children to the French school for not the whole time, but certainly at the beginning. And it was highly structured. And there was very little concern as to the learning process, but it was, you know, learning information and never mind whether or not you can cope with it or not. I think, but on the other hand, you know, the education system has been opened up to deal with learning disabilities and disabled people in a way that was never the case. We never saw those young people. So there have been pros and cons. But I think my big concern is that the government or the whole political process seems to not be very conducive to creating a positive environment for people. And in education, that's the most important thing. As a teacher, you create a positive environment for the learning process. But here we have all these stumbling blocks. And if you don't speak, and the things that are being put in place, you know, you don't learn a language in 6 months. And some people have to wait 3 months in order to even get the language course, let alone have 6 months. So the structures, the infrastructure is totally out of date and totally ineffective and really does not meet the needs. And you know, the French system is different. You know, there's a different modus operandi. But that modus operandi is sort of no longer working in a way that perhaps it did. And so there are all these restrictions and this unknown, and, you know, you want to find out accountability. Where's the accountability? You know, there's no accountability. And in order to get any accountability, you've got to go through all sorts of hoops of getting access to using the Information Act and all that kind of stuff. It's not very transparent. And yet in our organizations, we've got to be transparent. So, you know, we try to be anyway.
Now, the next question, before I ask you that, I'm going to just inquire, have you had an opportunity to see the documentary, What We Choose to Remember?
No, which is that? No, I haven't.
It's I don't know if you are aware of a gentleman by the name of Guy Rogers.
No.
Guy Rogers was head of EPCA, an educational institution here in Quebec. Okay. He produced, directed, and wrote a documentary that came out in the last 6 months called What We Choose to Remember. And it's Quebec, how we got to where we are in Quebec as seen through the lens of immigration.
Oh, yes.
It is an absolute must-see. What I'm going to do with that after we've finished here is I'm going to send you a link and you can watch it on your computer, or if your TV is hooked up to the internet, yeah, you can do that too. But I'll send you the link and it's free of charge. It's a must-see, and he's a good friend of mine. In fact, he had a hand in helping me with these questions. So, having said all of that, he used something in the documentary that was a very effective visual tool, which I'm going to ask you to use. It's a show of fingers. So I'd like you to indicate by a show of fingers on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
Well, I'm going to have 5.
Okay, very good. And finally, Renate, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
No, I certainly see, you know, I live in Quebec and I enjoy being in Quebec, but I'm also a Canadian. and I have lots of family still in Europe, so it's not as if I'm totally there or here. And I think as an immigrant, I've had the opportunity to take cultural things from all the communities that I'm part of and make it my own. And I've been able to do that in Quebec, and I've been able to do that in Canada. But the thing that really is, and I'm a real news junkie, so I like to think I'm aware of what goes on. But what is becoming so much more of the attention is this political wrangling. And it happened, between Canada and the provinces. Canada can make all sorts of policies, but if the provinces implement it, they use their own things. Nobody talks to each other, and the healthcare accord thing that is presently going on is point of fact here. It's this constant decision making. Seems to have taken on this overall negative perception. And to me, some people say, well, you worry too much about it. I said, well, I don't worry, I just see it. And it doesn't help. It doesn't help my sense of really wanting to belong to this, and yet it's a reality. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, we don't have a war. We are truly ought to be thankful, grateful for all the privilege and all the opportunities we have. And an immigrant, I can say that.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Renate. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I'd like to continue a discussion with you.
Okay.